Good morning, and welcome to Saturday morning, the 22nd of January. We are continuing through Michael Card's book entitled The Nazarene, and we've been going through the Gospel of Matthew with his help and the help of some song lyrics by him and others, and just to focus on Jesus. Just to focus on Jesus. We need that. We need that. Well, we're going to leave Matthew behind. We're finished hearing from Michael Card about him, and now part 2 of the book is Mark, the beginning of the gospel. Mark, the beginning of the gospel. I imagine him young, impressionable, sitting at the feet of Peter, who called him his son. 1 Peter 5:13. Eusebius, an early church historian, Eusebius tells us some members of the church had been urging him to write down Peter's testimony before it was too late and the Roman persecution caught up to him, which it eventually did. The persecution had begun, and it was becoming obvious that Peter might not have long to live, which ended up being the case. So in a very real sense, Mark's gospel is Peter's story. It could be said that the church started in his mother's home in Jerusalem. Not just the Jerusalem church, but the church. They pray there when Peter is in prison. I like to think that Jesus' Last Supper was held there as well, and that the young man carrying water back to the house was Mark himself in Mark 14:13. Without a doubt, when Peter is busted out of prison by the angel in Acts 12:12, it's Mark's house he flees to. Paul tells us that the remarkable early church leader Barnabas is Mark's cousin in Colossians 4:10, and that Paul and Barnabas took Mark along with them on their first missionary journeys until there was a disagreement between the two regarding Mark himself. When their journey turned inland to Perga, the young Mark decided he had had enough and went home. His uncle Barnabas understood the young man's dilemma, forgave him, and eventually took him along on later missionary journeys. Paul, however, never understood and parted ways with Barnabas over this disagreement. He did eventually forgive Mark, however. In 2 Timothy 4:11, he asks Mark to rejoin him in Rome. The cousin of Barnabas, he traveled with Paul as well as Peter, and the church began in his home. What better credentials could the writer of the gospel, the first gospel, possess? The chronicles of Jesus' life began with his pen. In fact, gospel was a new literary form that Mark invented. Paul speaks of the gospel, but Mark writes a gospel. Paul speaks of the small g gospel. Mark writes a capital G gospel. The very first one, around AD 64, just after the Great Fire in Rome. It is the beginning of the telling of the story of Jesus, the very beginning. It is the beginning of a new literary form, the story of Jesus' life based on confession. It is the beginning for those of us who are not eyewitnesses to have a chance to really know Jesus of Nazareth. And Mark's gospel is where it all began. It's appropriate that he should have written those words because the gospel is in one sense began with him. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Mark 1:1. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. As I read that, I could not help but mark all the or I could not help but notice, maybe I shouldn't use the word mark, um, the influences in that young man's life. Who came to his house? Who did the parents invite over for dinners? What kind of people were they that early group of believers trusted them in their house to be a safe place? That someone like Peter would know, that's the house I need to get to, being newly released from prison. If any parents of younger children are listening to this today, I would like to challenge you to make sure that your children get into the right places where they're being influenced by godly people. Not just necessarily family members, but other godly people. I had that in my life as a kid. The other pastors that would come to my mom and dad's house when dad had them in to speak for Lenten services. The missionaries who would come by on their deputation through the area wherever dad and mom pastored. Those are the kinds of guests we had in our home. People from the church who were godly people were guests in our home. And Sue and I continued that. Our girls sat around a dinner table, a breakfast table, a lunch table, a restaurant table, hearing the stories of godly people's lives and their testimony to what God has been in their life, had been in their lives, and how He led them. Mark became of great influence in the early church because his family had his life influenced by Jesus, for sure, but by other godly people also. I challenge you to that. Don't get them so wrapped up in extracurricular school activities that they have no time for church or youth groups, to be influenced by other godly people in their lives. As parents, we need all the help we can get so that we're not doing it all on our own. That's the challenge for today. Blessings to you, and take a lesson from the outcome of Mark's life.